to the Reluctant Christian Feminist. Today I'm talking with my friend Jess Nagy, and we're going to talk about raising resilient children in situations where maybe it isn't the best relationship with your spouse. So let me bring her on. She can talk a little bit about herself. Jessica?
Hi, Kate. Thanks for having me. So, about me. Well, let's see. I live in Arizona. It's way too hot here. And I have certifications in mental health coaching, in resiliency, in NLP, and in Truth 316 resources. But the most important title that I hold is just 3 letters, MOM. And I often say that my children saved my life because I don't know that I ever would have gotten to a point where I was worth saving, and therefore my marriage needed to take second place. But when I realized that the pain in my marriage was causing me not to be able to show up well as a mom, I knew things had to change. And so that was the beginning of a journey that ended up taking me out of my marriage. And that same journey that brought me to the point of founding Mosaic Motherhood, because while my kids saved my life before, I realized that now it was my turn to save theirs. And there weren't a lot of resources available for my children. I had a ton of resources available for me in my unhealthy relationship, but how to help my children navigate that both in the transition out of that relationship of mine, there really weren't very many. And so I decided that I was going to create them, and here we are.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think we can take a lot of our experiences and share them with other people to create, better situations for everybody. And mom is really important to me. And, as you're talking about living in Arizona, I live in Florida. It's also hot here. The temperature might be a little lower in number, but the humidity is horrible here. So I've been in Arizona, and dry heat is still hot, and it's very uncomfortable. So
Yes, it is.
yeah. So from our experience, have air conditioning. That's what I would say about my experience with that. As far as being a mom, clearly this is also for me one of the most important titles I carry. And it's so unfair because I have some other titles and I worked really hard to get to those titles, but mom can kind of happen without a lot of preparation. You find yourself all of a sudden responsible for other human beings and you love them, and maybe you don't have the right skill set to give them the type of experience you want to give them. We can also be so impacted by the fears of the way that we were raised. So we don't want, I don't want plenty of things for my kids that I experienced myself when I was a child. Please, Lord, protect them from this. Don't let them go through that. And, it's also hard to say, okay, this is the hard part as a mom, that hard experiences are part of their life story too.
Yeah, you're right. That is very difficult.
Yeah.
It's difficult even when they have come out of and conquered some of those hard experiences, even when when you've come out of and conquered some of those hard experiences and you're better for it, it still doesn't make it any easier to watch them face it for some reason.
Yes. And so you're right that having the skills as a mom to help your kids go through their own difficult experiences, we're not going to be able to remove all the hardship. So what can we do to help build resilience in our kids? Now, I've prepared a lot of questions, but as we're talking about resilience, I want to start with in the middle, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that I used to hear a lot when I was a kid, and then as I became a mom, I'm almost intolerant of it, is kids are resilient. They'll get over it. And I saw a facial expression on that. You talk about building resilience, and building resilience is good. But what do you think about this idea that it's okay for our kids to endure hardship? They're resilient. They'll get over it.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. I love that you said you're sort of intolerant of it. I get pretty worked up when someone comes back with that as well. And I have to try pretty hard to temper my response. This is a particular soapboxy issue for me. I'm sorry, but kids are not resilient. At least they're not inherently resilient. It's not something that we are born with. And the way that I explain this is, if that were the case, none of us would ever be messed up from anything that happened in our childhood. And we know that's not true. It's
Yeah.
just not true. And the other thing that I hear a lot is, oh, they'll bounce back,
Mhm.
which also frustrates me, because there is no bouncing back to a place we were before we knew something or before we experienced something. For
Right.
example, you cannot go back to the way you were before you knew about Jesus. Even
Mhm.
if you backtrack in your faith, you can't unknow that experience. You can't unhave that experience. And the same is for trauma and hardship in our children and in ourselves. We can't go back to a place that we were before we experienced that trauma. We are no longer that person. We have that trauma. We have that experience. We can heal from it. Absolutely. But just like a physical cut may leave a scar, those emotional wounds are also going to leave a scar. So I like to say, all of those things, they are myths. And here's the truth of the situation: resilience is built over time.
Yeah.
I like to define resilience as a continual moving forward towards a point of being able to experience hardship, pressure, and overwhelming situations without succumbing to that pressure or other people's expectations. And we're never going to arrive this side of heaven, but we can continue to move forward towards that. And we will build that resilience in ourselves, and we can help build that resilience in our children. And the forward moving it's a progression. It's not this hit a wall, bounce back. And someone said something to me one time when I was speaking at a conference on this topic, and they said, God knows our past from our future. The enemy is always trying to pull us backwards, but
Right.
God separates that past from that future. So bouncing back is not helpful. We're going to move forward with his help.
Yeah, I think the other damage that does is it says that if you are impacted by what happened in your past, then you need to get over it. Like this idea that the past is in the past. But like you said, it does affect us, like, and there are some things, that are, you think about the significant things that happen in your life, significant ones, whether good or bad, they do change you. I can think
Absolutely.
about the death of my best friend is like a really sad part of my life. And I am not unchanged by that fact. So
Absolutely.
now I know you work mostly with women who choose to stay in, or for whatever reason, whether it's their choice or not, in relationships that are maybe less than ideal. Can you talk a little bit about those types of situations that you're generally helping with?
Yeah, so I would say that currently the majority of my clients are choosing to stay. However, I also work with women who have chosen to leave and are concerned about sending their children back into that space. And so there's a bit of a different, I would say the tactics are the same, but the strategy tends to be a little bit different on both sides of that equation. And the women who choose to stay often choose to stay out of fear. And when a woman comes to me and she's choosing to stay out of fear, typically I'll refer her out first, because a lot of those fears have to do with her relationship and her marriage. And
Mhm.
I really like to work with women on empowering their children. We are breaking chains for the next generation. And frankly, there are so many great resources out there for her in her marriage situation that I can't even begin to touch that. So
Yeah.
that would be the first step. But if she has consciously made that choice, and she has made that choice knowing that it is a choice she is making daily or moment
Mhm.
by moment, or however she realizes that, and she knows that that choice is her own, she has ownership of it, then there may be other fears that need to be worked through, like, how do I protect my children when my partner comes at me verbally? How do I protect their hearts? How do I show them a positive marital relationship when I don't have one? And a lot of times they're, we're not going to shield our children, like you were talking about before. We're not going to completely shield our children from that. And hiding and pretending is never the answer. Whereas having open and honest conversations, regardless of your children's age, will help build that resilience. And then taking ownership for our own emotional regulation and teaching and modeling that emotional regulation to our kids is what is going to continually compound that building of resilience. So that's on the side of those who choose to stay. On the side of those who choose to leave, I generally tend to help them through this idea that floats around out there that the best way for me to help my kids is to fight in court until I have nothing left except my kids. And somehow, by some miracle, I'm going to win. I really don't stand behind that. I also think that is a myth. I think it's compounding that fear that they have that my children are going to be irreparably damaged by this person that I have chosen to leave. And that's not necessarily the case. But whereas spending all of that time, energy, finances, all of our resources in fighting is typically not the best way to win our children's mental health, conserving a lot of that energy and resources towards building up our inner strength and building our children's resilience in that situation, whether they have to go back 50% of the time, 40% of the time, or only 10% of the time, or not at all, is a much better way to make sure that our resources are being spent in the right direction. And then on both sides of the equation, I will walk them through a series of techniques for emotional regulation, formula that I came up with based on the book of Matthew, and help them to really work with themselves first and then their children and then outwards.
Yeah, and you're talking about taking a lot of active steps while your children are in these difficult situations. I think a lot of people are maybe hoping that some passive strategies, like just praying over your kids alone, and I'm not saying don't pray over your kids, definitely pray over your kids, but that praying alone is enough, or pleading the blood of Jesus. But I do feel like there's need to do more than just passively hope and pray. And of course, there are situations where you just have to hope and pray. Okay, there are situations where you really, like, if your kid got taken away or stuff like that, there's sometimes you're limited with what you can do. But what would you say to somebody who is afraid almost to take action, maybe afraid to make the situation worse by agitating it?
Yeah, well, I would say that I agree with you. There is something to be said for not poking the bear, proverbially, but that has its time and place. Now, if a woman is outside of her relationship and she has a safe place to return to, then sometimes it may not be necessary to poke the bear. If you are in the relationship, it sometimes may be necessary for your own clarity. And if your children are old enough for their clarity, for you to push back a little bit, to set some pretty firm boundaries and say, hey, I'm not okay with this. And here's what I will do about that for myself and for my children. But again, I feel like this is a very tight rope to walk. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I often tell women, you take every choice and every interaction as a separate moment. There is a time and a place to observe the pattern. Absolutely. And there is a time and a place to teach your children about that pattern. However, once you've observed that pattern and you've made a choice, whether to stay in or leave your marriage, the pattern makes no difference anymore because you are not being responsible for that other person. You can't force your partner to do anything, whether you're married or not. And so that's where this moment by moment, choice by choice, interaction by interaction plan comes in, where you say, in this moment, in this interaction, is it worth it for me and for my children for me to push, or should I compromise?
Yeah. And I just want to come back and say, like, about the active part and growth. We were talking earlier about how people, men and women both, get into this situation where their partner's unhealthy. And in many cases, you meet with somebody, you're at a certain place in your growth and they're at the same place. And then when you get married, one of you continues to grow and the other stays stagnant. And that, just by growing, sometimes you can create kind of like a disconnection between your spouse, and it can create, and that's another way of poking the bear. Sometimes it feels like, it's like, do I continue to pursue my own personal growth, or do I stay down at the level where I used to be 5 years ago and where my partner still continues to be? So like, it can sometimes feel like choosing yourself seems selfish, choosing your personal growth seems selfish. And you could make everything easier in your relationship if you would just like stay backwards in your spiritual growth, or in your pursuing your professional development, or whatever that case might be.
Yeah, and I would say those are probably the hardest positions to be in. It is fairly easy to make, and I don't say that word lightly, just for lack of a better word, but it is easier to make a decision when it's very clear cut that you have a relationship that is toxic.
Right.
But where it's just a matter of uneven growth, that
Mhm.
is such a heart-wrenching place to be,
Yeah, because I
because
don't want to give up on that person. Like,
exactly. Not only that, the love that you have for that other person can be so great that you see all of that potential in them. But
right.
until they see it for themselves and act on it, there is going to be this disparity
Mhm.
unless you choose to allow that and be in that uncomfortable place, or choose to remove yourself from that uncomfortable place. So I just have so much compassion. I have a client right now who's stuck in that very situation. I just have so much compassion for that place, because it is not easy. No matter which direction you choose, it's not easy.
Yeah, I mean, that's super complicated, and I want to also express my compassion for anybody in that situation, because I want to say, on the one hand, continue to push forward and pursue your personal development. And yet I do recognize that your partner might end up seeing like this disparity and this disconnection and feeling abandoned. Like, what you built your life on with them so many years ago isn't good enough for you anymore. So
Right.
that is tough.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about, and something I see, and I see this among women because I am a woman, but I'm guessing it probably happens with men too. And that is where you see your partner as just another child that you have to care for. And we're talking a little bit about building resilient children in an unhealthy relationship. And sometimes when you are in that unhealthy relationship, you tend to kind of see that other person as just another child. How do you contrast how you see your children and how in your relationship with those compared to supporting a spouse, or even maybe supporting a co-parent, if that's the case?
Yeah. I mean, it can be as simple as brain development. Children's brains are not fully developed until the new brain science says 25. So
Mhm.
if you have a 25-year-old partner or older, their brain is fully developed, and we can, again, simplifying it down, because I know it's not this simple, but to simplify it down, they're making a choice. Whereas your children aren't always making a conscious choice. They may be acting out of behavioral age, they may be acting out of mental age, and those two things can be different sometimes. And as parents, our job is to teach and train up a child in the way that they should go. And part of that is helping them to understand their emotions, to understand their choices. And we start by modeling that. Whereas it can be easy to see a partner who we don't consider to be helping or growing or working towards the shared goal that we thought we had, and to think of them as another dependent. And they may function as another dependent. However, the difference is that we can logically appeal to them, we can emotionally appeal to them on an equal level. Our children, we may need to logically or emotionally appeal to them on a slightly different level. Now, please don't hear me say that I think that our children are, of lower status than us. They may be of lower intelligence, they may be of lower development, but status, I believe that God has man, woman, and children all on equal status, because in the garden he says to go and take care of the earth. At that point, there were no children. And at that point, he didn't say, you two parents take care of the earth and, raise up your children, and the children will take care of the earth when they're adults. That wasn't stated in the Bible. So I think there is a real danger of seeing our partner as a dependent. And what that does is two things. It takes away their agency to own their own responses. And it shows our children that we are not respecting them as adults, and we are not really respecting their agency. And our job as parents is to teach our children to have that agency. And, here in America, we talk about independence. It's July. Independence Day was last week. We talk about building independence in our children, but what we're really talking about is agency, their ownership of their choices, their ownership of their responses, and their ownership of their emotions. And when we treat another adult as someone who does not have that ownership or that agency, then we're not doing a good job of modeling that for our kids, and we're not doing a good job of loving that other adult well, the way that Jesus loved in the Bible, in order to hold someone accountable. Like, for example, the rich young ruler. The rich young ruler came to him, said, "What do I need to do? I've done all of these good things." And Jesus says, "Go and sell your possessions and give the money to the poor and come and follow me." And the rich young ruler went away sad, but Jesus didn't run after him begging him or saying, "Oh, you know what? That's okay. I'll sell your possessions for you and I will drive you in my," or I don't know, pull you along behind me, because I guess at that point they walked everywhere. But he didn't take away that young man's agency. He allowed him to go away. He was sad. The young man was sad. My guess is that Jesus felt a sadness in his spirit as well, but he continued to allow him to have that agency because he was an adult. So hopefully that answers your question, Kate, too. If you have any follow-up, just let me know.
That and more. Yes, I do have a follow-up, because and this isn't maybe a question maybe for you, but just a question for us to continue to pursue in life as it is. And I always, and by the way, I'm not a Calvinist. I totally believe in free choice and that people choose. And I'm also a reluctant Christian feminist, so I don't believe in umbrellas. So I don't believe that, it's the, Jesus's umbrella covers the husband's umbrella. I mean, Jesus' umbrella is enough for me. His umbrella is not broken, and that's good. So I agree with everything you say. That being said, I have wondered, and Jesus does give us free choice. I can see it in many, many places, but I have wondered how much free choice we actually have when our free choice is compromised due to trauma or triggers or mental illness or mental capacity. Sometimes it's like, I think there's this human factor that says, I'm going to recognize somebody's agency, but also recognize maybe their decreased capacity for making a change based or making a choice based on the situation they're in. For instance, as simple as if my daughter doesn't have something to eat, sorry, honey, her capacity for choosing good things is diminished. Like, it's not as easy for her to make a good choice. And if somebody's dealing with mental illness or depression, or if they're triggered in a particular thing, or if they're in the middle of a panic attack, their ability to choose in that moment or at this time of their life could be at a decreased capacity. So I think if you know this person that you're with and you love this person that you're with, you can see the small changes and recognize them and be respectful of the changes they're trying to make, and not expect them to, like, pull themselves up by their bootstraps and have the whole world at their feet, because you're a living, God created you in the image of God. So you should be able to have everything in your life together.
Absolutely.
Your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that's where, each individual situation, just like each individual, is different. And I see a lot of women, making counseling appointments for their husband and then begging them to go, and then, driving them to the appointment. All of that is, I think, a bit much. I think all of that steps over the line from helping and steps into the realm of enabling.
Yeah.
Whereas if you notice something is off and you say, hey, I know you've struggled with this in the past, maybe it's time to go and see someone new, or maybe it's time to give your therapist a call, or maybe it's time to go to your doctor and ask about a med adjustment. and then allow them to take responsibility for that. Now, if they come back and ask for help, you can absolutely be compassionate and give them a hand up. But doing everything for them, again, is then treating them as a child, which
Right.
is taking away some of that dignity and respect that we hold
Yeah.
as adults.
Yeah, I agree. I think that when you look at Jesus, you see the way he treated other people, like the rich young ruler. By the way, you're reading my mind because the rich young ruler keeps coming up lately. But if you compare how Jesus approached the widow of Nain, she was leaving the city to bury her son, a widow, her only son, only means she had nothing left, and she probably had no faith at all. Jesus didn't stress her out or asked her to do anything. He just went over and raised her son to life. I think he saw exactly where she was, and he I don't think it's enablement, because I don't think she had the power to believe in that moment. Certainly had lots of power to believe afterward. And then you
Oh,
see
yeah.
the Samaritan woman or the Syrophoenician woman, same story, but they call it different things in different gospels. And Jesus like baited her because he was like giving her opportunities to stretch her faith, giving her a platform to show what she was capable of. So I think in the one sense, he just didn't ask the woman anything. He just went over and did for her what she needed. In the other, he baited her and stretched her faith. And I think in the same way, I mean, we're not Jesus, we don't know the other's heart, but we can know, especially our partner. If there's anybody we know, it's our kids and our partner. And we can see, like, do they need a swift kick in the pants? Do they need me to tell them they need to make that appointment? Do they need me to tell them who they should call or give them some suggestions? Then maybe that's true. Otherwise, we need to say, maybe less work needs to be done.
Yeah, I love the examples that you gave, and I think that's also where observing the pattern comes in. And
Yeah.
like you said, with our partner and with our children, we know.
Hmm.
And being observant, sometimes even taking a step back and saying, I feel like I'm looking at this and I'm sensing something here, but let me just take a week or a
Hmm.
few days or a month and just really hone in on what is the pattern. Maybe even writing it down for ourselves. And writing it down is not, to come at somebody with this list of things that you've observed, but it's to validate yourself in what you're seeing. And I think that's where the pattern can be super helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I think looking at the pattern and seeing maybe what does my partner need from me? What does love look like in this situation? I think that can be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Okay, in your opinion, when do you feel like someone should seek some sort of help? It could be a group, or it could be an online coach, it could be a professional therapist. But at what point do you think that because I don't know that everybody recognizes it. And
Yeah,
basically, you might have been told, you don't need those people. They're just going to fill your head full of crap. And, that's all you need is to read the Bible. So when is it that we recognize, like, oh, I might be out of my depth on here?
yeah, I think it is very challenging, especially for those who have grown up with any level of fundamental or legalistic sort of religious traditions, and whether that's Christian, evangelistic, or something else. It can be really tricky to navigate that because you're right. We sort of feel like it's our job to perform ourselves out of whatever difficult situation we find ourselves in, and that's not always possible. So I think the easiest way and the first thing that I would say to someone is, are you functioning as the baseline version of yourself? And I really wanted to say as the best version of yourself, but let's be honest, we don't always function as the best version of ourselves, even when we're perfectly healthy mentally and physically. So if you know where your baseline is, and if you're not functioning to that level, if you're not showing up as the person who you want to be and normally show up to be on that baseline level, then I would say it's time to reach out for some help. I think also when it comes to our kids, I'll use myself as an example. When I felt like mom was the last remaining thing that I was able to get right. And when I couldn't get that right anymore, that was a big indication for me. And so if you can see that you are not showing up as a healthy baseline version of yourself with your children, or if your child is not showing up as a healthy baseline version of themselves, then it may be time to bring in more help, a team. That could be as simple as a trusted friend or group of friends. It could be, like you said, an online coach. It could be a counselor. It could be as simple as, the school counselor, the school nurse for one of your children. And I think we're getting to a point in our church history, if you will, where that is becoming more accepted. And we're beginning to realize as a body that, the body doesn't work without all of the parts working together. And sometimes some of those other parts don't necessarily live in the building of the church. So that's what I would say. Your baseline, your children's baseline. If you're functioning beneath that, then I would say it's time to seek out some help.
I love your answer. I have to say, that's not what I thought years ago. I would think that, if me at my best is 100%, then I had to finally seek help. Like, I wasn't allowed to seek help. And some of that is that culture, but also is that, American, I'm not sure what it's like to be any other nation or anything like that, but this American sort of independence, this sort of thing, like, you can't ask for help because it's admitting you're not enough. And so there's that sense of like, okay, I'm not going to ask for help unless I'm at like, if my best is 100% until I'm like at 0.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're saying more like 80.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard a statistic one time. I think a lot of the positive discipline sort of parenting resources out there say, you only have to be a good enough mom 80% of the time. Like, you only have to get this right this version of the time. And I remember speaking on another podcast and somebody said, yeah, I think 80 is still the bar is a bit too high. I think statistically, we keep the bar a bit too low, because as far as statistics, like medical statistics, they think that 30% is the maximum reachable goal. And I'm thinking, I say, let's go for somewhere in the middle there. But yeah, if you're not at 100%, let's be honest, I'm not at 100% today. I didn't get enough sleep last night. My children just left for 3 weeks with their dad out of the country. And yet that doesn't mean that I'm going to send you an email and say, hey, Kate, I can't be on today because I'm not at my best. Well, if that were the case, nothing would ever get done. And also, what new mom is at her best?
Yeah. Or even at this best, like this idea, this is a false idea of having to get everything right. And if God is only going to work with people who have things right, he's got nothing to work with.
Amen. Amen. I mean,
I'm going to get a lot of things wrong. And I think that actually is a really good situation as a mom to teach your kids resilience when you mess up and you are honest with the times you've messed up and how you make it right again. It's a really, really good lesson for your kids too.
Amen.
All right. In your opinion, we talked about this before we started, and this is this idea that our kids are going to go through hardship. Or maybe we started at the beginning. So we know our kids are going to go through hardship, and we don't want our kids to be in a situation where mom and dad are at each other's throats or that they're like not together anymore. And yet that is the reality for a lot of parents today. Mm-hmm. So can you give us some hope on redeeming that situation? So we have this bad situation. How can we teach our kids some skills that will help them for the rest of their lives? Like, what good can come from this toxic, potentially toxic environment?
Well, again, I'll start with my situation, and I will say that as difficult and heart-wrenching and toxic, truly toxic as my situation was, there are 3 things, at least 3 huge things that I pulled out of that relationship that make me say, I would not go back and change one moment of that. Mm-hmm. The first 2 are my children. Yeah. Really and truly, before I was married, I never envisioned myself having kids. I never thought I would be a good mother. I did not think it would come naturally to me. I didn't love kids. I mean, I liked them okay. And I was even a teacher for a brief moment in time. But there was this very real understanding that, like, I cannot do this on a very high level. Like, I am not going to be able to teach and have my own children. So the minute I got pregnant, I was like, okay, and we're done. However, I don't know that I would have ever gotten past that, except for the fact that I had my kids. And even when I look back at the way that I parented my children, oof, in my marriage, my goodness, there is a reason that my youngest is so much better at regulating his emotions than my oldest, because I stepped over the line and became toxic because I could not deal with the toxic that was around me. And
Right.
so the hope that I would offer in that is that there is a very real phenomenon called post-traumatic growth,
Yep.
where we can be growing, in a steady level, and then we have this dip or this trauma or this event or whatever it is, and then our growth just takes off. And that really was the case for me. There really was this moment of, I'm not showing up well for my children. I'm not hardly showing up for my children.
Mm-hmm.
Then this decision point, this transition period, and then, oh man, parenting is this wonderful, joyful experience. Is it hard? Yes, but it is not anywhere near hard the way it was in that situation. And so through that, the skills that I've learned and built and the training that I've had, I would say the number one thing to build your kids' resilience and to help them grow stronger despite, or sometimes even because of, that difficult family dynamic, or what I like to call destructive family system, is really showing them how to regulate their emotions. When we are able to regulate our emotions in a difficult time, we widen that window of tolerance. If we're able to tolerate this much low and this much high without, completely losing our stuff, and then we learn how to regulate, that window grows wider and wider, and they will be able to withstand the hard in the moment, and they will be able to withstand so much more hard in the future by doing that one simple thing.
So can I ask about helping your kids regulate their emotions? Is this something you're okay with talking about?
Absolutely.
So some kids, just hypothetically speaking, not my own children, of course, some kids make it super easy to regulate their emotions, not because they have easier emotions, but because they're more visible with their emotions. So you can see, like, hypothetically speaking, I've got one child who's super easy to tell what's going on. Everybody in the neighborhood knows what's going on with this one. The other one, it's hard to help this other one regulate their emotions because it doesn't let anybody see it. I mean, it's so super private. And I end up guessing, hypothetically speaking, I would guess a lot about what's going on, because sometimes I think that there's more going on under the surface, but I have to guess because they're not comfortable talking about their emotions. So, like, one, you would think it's harder because the emotions are so screaming at you, but it's actually easier because you can see exactly what's going on, and the other is under the surface.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I happen to have that same situation in my house. And you're right. On one hand, it is much more difficult with a child who wears their proverbial heart on their sleeve, and, their anger and their tears and their all of the things.
All of the things.
It's hard because it wears us.
Right.
And when we are physically, emotionally exhausted and drained, then we have a harder time regulating ourselves, which means we have a harder time co-regulating, which means we're not doing a great job of teaching anyone anything. However, in that moment, if we can regulate, it is easier to regulate an emotion that is seen than to regulate an emotion that is unseen. And I think the same principles apply for the child who is very private and who does not allow a lot of that to surface. And there may even be something there where it's like, I might want to talk about this with someone else, but I sure don't want to talk about it with mom, or I sure don't want to talk about it with dad, or whatever the case may be. And I think we can push to a certain extent and really just be observant of our child's body. And there's something about noticing microfacial expressions, or a tensing of a leg, or even a pulling back, even if it's just as simple as a hand movement pulling back. I've studied a few incredible therapists who work a lot with the body and somatics and that sort of thing, and they've talked about how even a simple gesture of reaching out and taking something can be so difficult for certain clients. And so if we're able to recognize that in our children, then we can bring that out, whether they decide to air the real why behind it or not. We can say, hey, I'm noticing that, your feet just tucked underneath a little bit. What's going on with you right now? Or something that I love to do with my clients for their children and then my own children is I'll notice something. I'll say, hey, can you take a body scan real quick? And what I generally mean by that is, let's check in with your thoughts. Let's check in with your feelings, and let's check in with your body. And I'm going to tell you something, Kate, we are so good at the first one. We're relatively okay, especially as women, with the second one. But our culture is so terrible at knowing what our body wants and needs in any given moment. As simple as, am I hungry or am I bored? And I'll come right out and say, I have struggled with that. And this is the thing that's taken me the longest time, still in process, by the way, of unlearning. And therefore, how am I supposed to expect my 16-year-old or my 8-year-old or my 2-year-old to be able to understand that if it's so deeply ingrained in our culture that our body is to be overridden?
Yeah, you're right. And it is like our body needs to be overridden. My body's often telling me, I'm listening to it all the time, but it's usually saying, I want ice cream. So
yeah, my body says that quite a lot too.
Every once in a while, I'll open the fridge and I'm like, what you're looking for isn't in here. Close the refrigerator. Just kidding. So when it comes to children, the ones that are very outward, like you said, I think it's exhausting. This particular child between 3.5 and 4.5 was the hardest year of my life by far. It was just incredibly challenging. The other child, so happy during childhood, always smiling, has now hit teenage years, and it's not the same. Very private, and didn't grow up sharing emotions, just grew up sharing a smile, like everything was okay and telling the whole world that it's okay. But I do feel like, having been the child, the quieter one, and hearing the squeaky wheel gets the grease, I feel neglected from when I was a child. Like, my needs were not as important as my sister's because she was far more verbal about them. So I didn't want to miss the needs of the child who is silently sitting there and trying to hold it together.
Yeah, I love your mother's heart for that. And I think it's interesting to note that, you were that child, and that gives you this double-edged sword with which to play. On one side, what that feels like. And so you so desperately want to combat it and help and, interfere so that her needs or his needs are met. Yeah. And at the same time, a lot of that can be unconsciously modeled in our own lives. And that's why it's so important as parents that we get our healing worked in process.
Right.
It's never going to be done. We're never going to be healed this side of heaven. And we're always going to mess up, and we're always going to be a mess in progress. But if we're continually healing and going back to your point where, there may be this disparity in growth, that's why it's so important to just lean into that growth. Because if we are growing and healing, then we can break some of those chains that we may be carrying around without knowing it. And we can begin to bring those to the surface and allow them to become that squeaky wheel that then we give the grease to.
Yeah. Do you ever find that some of your clients, in working this stuff out, are then also confronting some of the ways they were raised themselves? So now I not only have this difficult relationship with my co-parent, but I also have a different relationship with my own parents. And I'm trying to, so caught between so many situations and doing it all at once. I can't imagine anybody doing it without help.
Yes, I would say that this is one of the most difficult points to work with my clients on, because it can be very easy to either continue along the path that may be somewhat rooted in denial of my parents are great. They did the best that they could. And their ways worked because I turned out all right. Because that is ignoring some of the things that we took on in our personalities and our behaviors that did not serve us well. And we're sort of ignoring that, and we're not confronting when that continues. On the flip side, it can also be very easy to say, oh my goodness, my parents or my dad or my mom is exactly like my partner, my ex, whatever. So I'm just going to write them off. They're toxic. I can't have them around my kids. And neither one of those situations is going to help you build resilience in that relationship, help you build your boundaries in that relationship, because, by the way, boundaries are exercised in relationship. And it's not going to show your children how to navigate that difficult relationship with their own parent. And it can even create, I would say, the potential for that difficult relationship with their parent to be with you. Because if you are not allowing this messy middle, then how are they going to feel comfortable coming to you and theirs?
Yeah, I can relate with a lot of that. I just think it's really hard sometimes to confront maybe your assumptions about your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we're raised and when we're in the house, we think our parents know everything. My dad was Google before there was a Google. I got anything answered by asking him. It's pretty embarrassing. That, and we had a chalkboard in our house, so he'd always like, let me show you. So we have this idea that our parents have so much knowledge and wisdom, and we love our parents for a lot of the stuff they did. And yet, it's just very, very different. I'm also caretaker to my dad right now. So, caretaker to my dad. My mom was living with me at the time that my kids were born, and that was interesting too. So, yeah, you have to say, maybe these assumptions I made about my parents aren't 100% accurate. And maybe I can be someone different than them. So,
yeah. And not only that, I can be someone different than them and still be in relationship with them.
yeah. And your kids are different than you were. So your kids need something different too.
Exactly.
So it's all different. It's all good. And we can all love each other. Just like we're giving ourselves a break for being less than perfect. We can do the same for our parents as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So can you give us some examples of people you've worked with, kind of like what they were telling themselves by staying in a relationship or leaving? What was it that caused somebody to reach out to you? Like, what caused that difference? I'm super interested in that. I think that probably most people try to get help too late. Not that it's too late for them. That's not what I mean. But they could have gotten help a lot earlier, and it probably may have been easier. And then how did that situation turn out?
Yeah. So I'm thinking of one client in particular who she reached out to me through a colleague of mine having written a book. She read portions of the book. She didn't even finish the book. Reach out to that colleague, and that colleague said, I think you need to go and see Jessica. And so she found me. She sort of followed me for a little bit, joined the free Facebook group that I have. And then when I launched my first small group, I piloted a program, a course, an online course, if you will, that was all done live. And then that small group turned into the pod membership that I have now. They were sort of, the beta testers of it, and they just haven't gone away. And I love them to pieces. And she did some individual work with me along the way in that journey. And I would say she's been with me now, oh goodness, like 2 years. And when she first came, she was really distraught. She really thought that her Christian walk was, witnessing her marriage. And unfortunately, the marriage that she has had, whichever of those terms fits, was not something that is going to glorify God. She had already, been in home separated very informally when she came to me. And she was very timid in being able to see her agency. She didn't see her agency. So between our work together, and I actually referred her to another colleague's program to kind of shore up those ideas of what does God actually say about our marriage? What does he actually want of us in that? And does he love the individual or the institution more? Spoiler alert, it's always the individual heart. So that there was a lot that was going on there. However, in my work with her as in her motherhood, in I would say the first year, she made a choice. She had been homeschooling. This was, through COVID time. She was convinced her husband at that point wanted nothing but homeschooling. He didn't even really believe in schooling at all. He was against public schools, Christian schools, basically everything. And he started down this trail of sort of the doom scrolling and the prepping and the world is going to end and the government's out to get us sort of spiral. And she said, for my mental health, I need to send the children back to school. I'm not asking. This is what I'm telling you. And that was her boundary. His response was, I'm not going to stop you, but I will never step foot in that school, in the pickup line, at any activity of my kids with regards to school. And she carried on in her choice, which was very difficult. And she carried on in her choice to send the children to school. And I remember she sent me a message with a picture fall of last year. And her kids were waiting for the bus. They were grinning from ear to ear. They had backpacks on their backs. The morning had gone relatively according to plan as much as it can. She has 4 kiddos. So she just said, none of this would have been possible without the encouragement and the structure and the village that you helped me to build. And she said, this is a huge win for me, and it is a massive win for my kids. And she has kept that up. They've now had the full school year under their belt, but she realized her agency. She put a boundary down, and now she really feels she's even been able to talk to women in her circle about the fact that, her marriage isn't perfect. She has spoken to pastors about the ways that they're missing certain things in the way that they approach their congregants or the way that they, give sermons or whatever. And she's really come to a point where she's been able to have very upfront and difficult conversations with her partner and say, here's the situation. I don't see you changing or moving. And he has validated that observation in her. And she continues to choose to stay. And she continues to choose to stay moment by moment, day by day. And if and when it becomes necessary for her to leave, she's also taken steps to enable that to be a possibility. But for the moment, she chooses to stay. She chooses to love him well by calling out the things that he's not seeing when necessary, by taking a step back when that's the best thing for her kids. And she's also shored up the team that she has built around her children. So that is the example that comes to my mind for the choosing to stay side.
Yeah, that's a really tough situation. And I know that it's so counter to what a lot of the fundamentalist Christian beliefs are, yes, which tell you as a wife, and of course, this is a reluctant Christian feminist, so you can have whatever opinion you want. I'm going to love you. But a lot of the fundamentalist cultures would say, in order to love your husband well, you have to be obedient. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being subject to one another, as Ephesians 5:21 says, like all believers working together, everyone submitted to each other for the working of the people, like the working of the body of Christ. I mean, if we are absolutely closed off to seeing the needs of others and meeting those as we can, then we're not really in a body of Christ. We're just me and God only. And I don't believe in that either. But rather than mindless obedience, you're teaching her that she has agency, and this is benefiting her relationship and her kids.
Yes, absolutely. Because now she's teaching them that they have agency. And whereas before she fell into the same trap, I suppose, that I did, where the marriage was front and center and everything else sort of fell by the wayside. And that included her kids. She's still working through a lot of pain about the way that they had their first, few years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of behavior issues that came from that as well. And yet she is determined. She's determined to move forward. Her kids are improving in their behavior. She's improving her relationship with them. She's able to take them to do, fun outings. And the reason for that is because she has a part-time job that serves also as her self-care.
Awesome. That's beautiful. And that's a heartbreaking story too.
Yeah, it's hard to see when someone has been given all kinds of invitations to grow and to change in love,
Mm-hmm.
and even confrontations in love, and they choose to stay in the same position. It is very heartbreaking.
Those types of messages that he seems fixated on seem to be very, very centered around a lot of fear. And that's really hard because people, aren't acting rationally when they're acting in fear.
Yes.
So, and he's not alone. There's lots and lots and lots of people like that.
There are.
I have been known to act in fear.
Me too.
So I'm not just throwing you under the bus. You're a human. I'm a human. We're all human. We all have problems when we're caught up in fear. But I think what's really interesting about this talk, and it brought to mind not only like when you get your health, you're activating yourself for your children and for yourself and for your husband, but also or wife, as the case may be, because this might be a man who's watching this as well. But you're also activating yourself for the body of Christ. I mean, when we're caught up in these situations and they're taking up so much of our energy, and getting out of the situation is also going to require a lot of energy. But on the other end, when we have our kids with the backpacks on waiting for the bus and they're smiling, I mean, there is an option for hope and joy on the other side.
Absolutely.
So tell people a little bit about where they can find you, where they can find what you do, and more information if they're interested in services for themselves. And I think you only serve moms, right?
I do. I have narrowed down the people who I serve so that it fits both my training and my experience. I don't have any experience being a dad. I have a great dad who has his own challenges. And, my kids have a dad who does get some things right sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But my experience is being a mom. And so I do only serve moms. I can refer out when there is a mom who is still very much interwoven in the woes of her marriage or her toxic relationship. I do tend to refer out to that. I like to work with moms who have centered themselves, grabbed a hold of their agency, made a choice, whatever that choice may be, regarding their difficult relationship, and now want to be able to empower their children in that choice that they didn't get to make. And so you can find me at my website, which is mosaicmotherhood.com. I have a few different offers. I do have a pod membership, which I mentioned earlier. I do some one-on-one coaching. And I've actually launched a new product, which is tandem coaching, that I'm really excited about. And that is where I work with a mom and a child parallel. Each individual gets their own session. Each individual gets their own confidentiality. And yet I am able to come at whatever each of them brings to me in light of the relationship and the good of the relationship. So, if a mom says, well, she's just, I can't stand it, she lies all the time, then without breaking confidentiality, I can come in and say, have you considered, that she may be afraid to tell the truth because of something the child has shared with me? And that goes both ways. And that's really interesting. It's something that I can do as a coach that I probably wouldn't be able to do as a therapist. And so
that's interesting.
On a tangent, but yes, you can find me on my website. You can also join my free Facebook group, which is Full Hands, Fierce Hearts. I do have a free download that is 4 keys to raising resilient kids. It's got some really awesome feet on the ground tactics to help with emotional regulation. It also has a formula based on the book of Matthew, where I see Jesus walking this out with the way that he teaches his disciples. And you can get that at mosaicmotherhood.com/4, spelled out FOUR-keys.
Yeah, and we'll put all those links in the comments. So if you didn't get a chance to write that down, or if you're in a car, it's okay. Don't try and text and drive.
Yeah.
Or write and drive, as the case may be. We'll put those links in the show notes so you can get to those. And I want to thank you for coming and sharing your wisdom. By far, like, I would do anything for my kids. Like, I'm all about, I want self-improvement. I create courses. I think that is all great, but I would sacrifice everything for my kids. And if I could just, know by laying down my life that I could make some of their stuff go away, I'd almost be willing to do that. And sometimes, in a sense, we are kind of doing that when we grow. We are laying down kind of like our preconceptions and our assumptions, and we're choosing something better. We're choosing to activate our agency, that a God-given gift, so that we can be better parents for our kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, Kate. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.